There are two things that you should know before you get too far into this, just in case you want to bail. Today, my grandmother told me that she has first-hand knowledge that time travel is possible. I believe her. Still with me? Good, because I have no idea where else I may find people who will hear me out, consider what I have to say, and maybe even believe me and help me figure out what to do next. Like many other people here, I stumbled upon Reddit and No Sleep, while scouring the internet looking for clues to either prove or disprove that I've completely lost my mind and gone crazy. I'm honestly not sure which one I'd prefer at this point, because if I'm right, and all of this is true, well, then I don't know what to believe about anything. This is long, but please, if you have anything to offer, I'm all ears. Let me back up a bit and introduce myself. You can call me Philip Ward. It's not my real name, and in fact, you can probably just assume that any names I use here, of people, places, and things, will probably not be true. There's not too much to say about me, really. I'm a few months away from 40, divorced. I have a 7-year-old kid, a son, who lives most of the time with his mother. I was a shitty husband, but I'm a good dad, or as much as I can be on Tuesday evenings and every other weekend. My ex-wife and I are friendly even. We can be at the same soccer game or school play without wanting to kill each other. She's been dating a decent enough guy for the past couple of years, and while I'll never invite him over for a beer, I have to admit that he's good with my kid and knows his boundaries. As much as I hate when people say they're married to their work, it's a pretty good way to describe me. I'm a cop, and I have been for the last 18 years. I've been a homicide detective for the past 8, and I love the job. I work in a medium-sized city in the Northeast, close to a major university. We'll call it the university for the purposes of my story. All of this is still new to me, and I don't want to make a wrong move, although I'm probably doing just that by telling you this in the first place. A year and a half ago, the 16-year-old girlfriend of a man I was arresting shattered my ankle and knee with a metal baseball bat. I was out for 12 weeks recovering from surgery and getting used to walking on my newly pinned and plated leg, which ended up being a centimeter shorter when all was said and done. Everyone in my department assumed I'd retire early, since I was so close to the standard 20 years most of the guys put in. I have to admit that I considered it, knowing I couldn't work a beat with a limp holding me back. Still, the thought of not working and being retired at 38 panicked me, so I opted for a desk job as part of the Missing Persons Homicide Joint Cold Case Squad. Me, a windowless subterranean room, and 92 case files of unexplained disappearances and murders dating back to 1888, which is when we stopped throwing records away when they weren't solved in a couple of decades. The Corporate Crime Unit, another desk job, has a staff of 3, a new Keurig, and a second-floor office. But who am I to complain? Beats sitting at home watching daytime television. Real-life cold cases aren't like the ones on television, which should be no surprise. Television would have us believe that many clues are waiting to be uncovered, a queue of witnesses just waiting to give new information, and a perpetrator still alive and nearby, waiting for a determined cop to knock on their door. The reality is that very few are ever solved. One of the first things I did when I got this job was to categorize the cases by likelihood of closure through a color coding system. My red tags are ones that there is virtually no likelihood of solving. Old, no evidence, no leads. My yellow tags have some potential, but nothing I can immediately work with. My green tagged cases have the best chance. They're fairly recent, they have unprocessed evidence, and there are decent leads available that could be followed up on again. Those are the cases I focus on. I revisit old suspects and witnesses, create a new profile with today's forensics, and have evidence processed to look for DNA exclusions or matches. Whatever I can do. I've closed 4 cases since I started about a year ago, and they've all been through DNA. A couple of those still had family around to give the good news to, and that was a pretty good feeling. But it wasn't like I did anything. I pulled a hair or a swatch of blood-stained sweatshirt from the bottom of a box and sent it to a lab for them to process, and they found a match in the database. I'm a detective. I'm never going to be truly happy until I'm solving something, truly solving it, finding patterns, discovering clues, and extrapolating theories. In addition to whatever green-tagged cases are in my rotation, I work to publicize our cold cases, try to get the news to run a segment on them, and visit crime theory forums to see if there's anything I can add to my coffer. I encourage tips from the public, but it's a rare day that my external phone line even rings. Most of the tips I get are from armchair detectives and internet sleuths who have taken up a hobby of trying to solve old murders. Some cops can't stand when they get these calls, on account that most of it has already been asked and answered or deemed improbable. But I don't mind them. From time to time, they've provided a fresh perspective that may pan out to something one day. This morning, my external line rang almost as soon as I'd sat down, balancing my laptop and bag with a contraband cup of coffee from the second floor. I was surprised to answer and hear the voice of my 92-year-old grandmother. You can call her Iris. After exchanging pleasantries, Iris cleared her voice and got right down to business. I need to tell you some things, and it has to be today. Can you be here in a half hour or so? The unusual request alarmed me. Of course I can. Should I call Dad? Is everything okay? No. Calling your father won't be necessary. I'm fine. Everything's fine. This is actually, well, it's work-related. There's a file you should have there in your archives, and you may want to bring it. It's for a woman who's been missing since 1947. Her name is Penelope Allswell. Do you want me to hold while you look for the file? There was no need. It was the first file I had alphabetized on the red tag shelves. Allswell, Penelope, 1947. I flipped through the file clumsily as I walked to my car and thumbed through it some more at stoplights on the way to the assisted living center where Iris lived. The case hadn't been touched since 1950 at least, but from what I could gather, the missing woman was a graduate student at the university when she disappeared without a trace. She was British by birth, reported missing by her boyfriend who was cleared by police on account of a solid alibi. There were no suspects, no familial inquiries about how the case was going, and no DNA on file. Nothing. Iris had been a student at the same university around the same time. Did they know each other? What kind of secrets was my sweet, funny, unassuming grandmother hiding? Iris was waiting for me in an oversized chair in the lobby when I arrived, dressed in her usual thick cardigan and slacks, and clutching an ever-present mug of tea that I suspected was sweetened with milk and sugar that her doctor forbid her to have. Her simple laced tennis shoes were pure white and without a mark. Her hair was soft white and expertly styled 3 times a week by a visiting beautician, and her age-spotted hands were soft, constantly cold, and adorned with the simple wedding band given to her by my long-dead grandfather. Philip, that was so fast. I'm glad you could come, and you found the file? That's good. I helped her from her chair and kissed her cheek. Let's go somewhere private to talk, shall we? Outside is best. With the dexterity of someone 30 years younger, she led me through the maze of hallways until we reached a small courtyard. The trees here are turning, and it's brisk, but pleasant enough to sit in the sun. There were Adirondack-style chairs lining a cobblestone patio, and we each took one. A little chilly, she said, bringing the folds of her cardigan into the center of her chest. But I need to make sure we're not overheard. Still a paranoid old lady after all these years. There's an euchre game in full swing inside, so most of those old coots will be a bit occupied. Those who aren't won't venture out when it's any cooler than 80 degrees, for fear their old thick blood will freeze in their veins. Still, she glanced around quickly. If you see someone I don't, make sure you stop me. I laughed slightly, despite myself. Iris, I'm ridiculously curious about what this is all about, but I need to tell you something before you even say a word about it. I have a duty to take a report on everything you tell me related to this case, and if there's anything, criminal, I'm obligated. Iris waved her hand in dismissal. I know all that, and I didn't do anything to Penny if that thought crossed your mind. But I do want to caution you. What I have to tell you, and more importantly, what you choose to do with it might not be something you want to go in the official record. I'll leave that to you. Why don't you tell me the story and we'll see where to go from there? Fair enough. She took a pull from her mug and sat it down on the arm of her chair. How much do you know about Penny's case? Not much, admittedly. There's not a lot in the file. No, I suspect not. What if I told you that the reason there's not much information about Penny is because some very powerful people worked very hard to prevent anyone from noticing Penny was gone at all? I raised an eyebrow. Powerful people like the government? The government, yes, in part. But there were others. See, Penny was involved in something very special and extraordinary and unique, as was I. And the truth is that she's not missing at all. She disappeared in a way, voluntarily, but in some ways she never left at all. Her face was animated, excited, and younger looking than it had been in years. Iris, I don't think I'm following here at all. Well, let me start from the beginning then, or at least the beginning that I know. Penny was about my age when we met as graduate students at the university. I've told you that I went there to study physics, no? Yes, you have. Was Penny also studying physics? No, she didn't have much of an aptitude for the sciences. She was what we used to call a social behaviorist, an absolutely brilliant mind with a knack for figuring people out. She knew philosophy, logic, psychology, and anthropology. And I used to stay up for hours listening to her talk about what made people enthralling. I suppose now she'd be called a sociologist, something along those lines. How did the two of you meet? I was recruited, I suppose you could say, to work on a project she was involved in, and we became friends and eventually roommates as well. What type of project? Iris's eyes glistened a bit as her normally reserved smile grew even broader. With a quick glance around her, she grabbed my hands and said, in a near whisper, "Time travel." I opened my mouth to respond, but then found I had nothing to say and quickly shut it. Oh, I know. It sounds crazy. Time travel. Now you see why it's taken me so long to speak of it. Early on, I was bound by an oath of confidentiality, but after a while I supposed no one was watching me anymore and I was tempted, many times, to tell someone. Why are you telling me now? I have several reasons, and they all relate to Penny. She and I suppose I was the only friend she had, and I barely knew her. She didn't know anyone here in the United States, so there were arrangements made for her to stay with me. Her appearance was rather plain, even for the time. Nothing that would stand out in a crowd. And she was an orphan, raised by some Sisters of Charity or something back in England, and sent to school by church benefactors. I think that was one of the reasons she was selected. She had no family to speak of, and no ties to much of anything. Selected for time travel? Yes. Our team was made up of 12 people. Penny, as I've mentioned, was the behaviorist. The first time I met her was when I was made to sit across from her and answer very peculiar questions about myself, my dreams, and my personal life. Later, I was told it was a screening process to see if we were mentally apt for the project. They needed people who were honest, loyal, adventurous, and dedicated. Penny had a face that didn't show emotion most of the time, but her demeanor wasn't cold. I was comfortable around her, so much so that I was honest in answering every question, even when I wasn't proud of the answer. She knew somehow when people were lying. It was a gift she had, or a curse, depending. I was part of the scientific group. In addition to me, there was a former professor of mine who brought me on board, another physicist, and a British chemist. There were 4 engineers, a couple of whom were Germans fleeing the war, who helped build the machines, a fellow from the army who was an expert on computers, an Austrian mathematician who later became quite famous for the theory he developed with us, and then a medical doctor with whom I believe you're acquainted. Grandpa? Iris winked. That's how we met, of course. Oh, Philip, I was in over my head. 23 years old and involved in something big, as they say. My professor, the one who brought me onto the team, he was impressed by some research I was doing into some quantum field theories, or so he said. Frankly, I think he was more impressed with my tushy and some of my other physical assets. I blushed at the thought of Iris as a young woman, tushy and all. So, your team researched time travel? Iris had been old for as long as I'd known her. She taught high school science for 40 years. She volunteered to read to children. She knitted sweaters and cooked a mean corned beef with cabbage. She did not work on top secret projects that involved missing women. She did not have secrets that had the potential to change life as we know it. She did not time travel for fuck's sake. Oh, we did more than research it. We didn't invent it, but we perfected it and expanded on it. We were backed financially by a group of people who, in one way or another, is still around today. Different faces, different bankrolls, but essentially the same bottom line. They have money, and they have power, and they have interests. I met a few of them, but for the most part, they stayed out of what we needed to do. Who were they? Oh, you know, politicians, dignitaries, bankers, some of the world's most famous scientists and richest citizens. I'm not quite ready to name names, but I'm sure you can fill in the blanks. Anyway, this all started prior to the war. In fact, there was a rumor amongst our group that the attack on Pearl Harbor was the very first PIREP. Obviously an unsuccessful one. PIREP? Ah, yes, an acronym. Past Integration Recreation Attempt Project. Essentially, travel through time is used to prevent something horrible and tragic from occurring. Our government developed the technology in tandem with the British, as it became clear that the world was heading in a direction that might be quite precarious. Apparently, there was some talk of inviting the Russians on board at some point, but I think everyone was quite happy that no one did. It was generally assumed that the Germans were working on their own version of the project. But after we stole some of their best scientists, and then decimated their country, they probably didn't get too far. Stole their best scientists? German scientists, who had some knowledge of time and space. Like Einstein. Iris's quick laugh cut me off before I could even get the word out. I may have met him once or twice. But the project was developed way before I came along. I was part of the team who carried out its function. Its function being traveling back in time to stop something bad from happening? Well, yes. Not quite as glamorous as movies make it out to be, eh? It was a job. We were bound by a very strict set of codes when it came to travel. No, using the machine recreationally, or without permission, but only under orders, and always for a specific purpose. Purpose? Well, it was different every time. Intercepting a package, making sure a certain person didn't catch a certain train, placing an envelope in a desk drawer for discovery. Sometimes we didn't know why we were doing the things we did, but from time to time there were some incredibly important projects. For example, what if I told you that President Roosevelt was assassinated? Assassinated. I was under the impression that he died of natural causes. Oh, he did. He did. Iris dismissively waved her hand again. The second time, that is. His first death occurred by poison about 2 years prior via an injection of curare. It was administered by a nurse, who turned out to be a fascist sympathizer, a member of Il Duce's Black Shirts. To lose our president in that manner at such a pivotal moment in the war would have been disastrous. And so you went back in time and stopped it? My grandmother, good old Iris Ward, is a time traveler. I found the thought strange, unsettling even, but for some reason, not entirely unbelievable. Not me, no. At that time, I was too much of a novice for such an important job. The chemist did it. He was able to give the nurse a taste of her own medicine, so to speak, and effectively stop her from going through with the deed. But Roosevelt died in office just a few years later. Why didn't anyone stop it then? Iris shook her head and shrugged. Nothing we could do. Despite the sound of it, there was nothing supernatural about what we did, Philip. It was science, not a miracle. We couldn't stop a man from a natural death. I sat silently for a moment. Iris, I'm trying to wrap my head around this, so you'll have to forgive me. She moved a soft, wrinkled hand to my cheek. I know. Take your time. Maybe I can explain it a bit better. She pulled a string from the bottom of her cardigan and held it up. This is how we've always been taught to think of time, you see? It has a start and it has a finish, like an hour or a minute. We developed the concept of time because we need the structure it offers as a society. We need to know when to be places, and how long to cook a chicken, and how many days it'll be until Christmas. And so, we measure based on a number of standards, some of them astronomical, and some of them just totally made up. The truth of the matter is that there is no such thing as time, and yet there are clear events that seem to occur in chronological order. So, it was theorized that what we think of as time actually looks more like this. She folded the string so that each end meant each other and pinched it tight. A closed time-like curve, it's called. We all have our own world line or path, you might say, on the time-like curve, but on occasion, there are closed loops that occur, and we can travel to our own past. And how do these closed loops happen? In our case, we made them happen through a series of complex, light-speed maneuvers and highly complicated machinery, the details of which even I'm not privy to. But I have reason to believe that they may occur naturally as well, completely by accident. That's only a theory, and one that was wildly unpopular with most of my contemporaries. But travel through time was once only a theory as well. How does it work? The logistics of it, I mean. Quite simply, one enters an equation into a machine and is transported back to a predetermined point instantaneously. There's no pain involved, although there is quite a bit of mental discord initially. Do you know the feeling of déjà vu? I nodded slowly. Imagine feeling that odd sensation for hours at a time. That's what time travel is like. So we practiced quite a bit before we went on a mission of any sort to make sure we could handle it. As I mentioned, there were some very important protocols we followed to make everything flow as seamlessly as possible. First of all, under no circumstances did we travel beyond our own timeline because there were too many unknown variables, and we needed complete control of the situation. Traveling to the future was only permitted to return to our own time once we'd completed whatever task we had. The second rule was that we only traveled back a maximum of 24 hours, and we only stayed back for an additional day, no longer. Why? Well, quite simply, we couldn't travel too far. The loop was closed for the first time in 1941. That's when the first traveler successfully left the present reality for the project. As hard as we tried, we could never manage to get further back than that moment. As for why, well, that's a bit more complicated. Here's another way to consider the concept of time. Imagine a maze that's teetering on top of a cone, really moving back and forth trying to steady itself. What happens when you drop a marble inside? It moves around the maze? No, the maze moves around it. The ball itself isn't moving. There is nothing inside of it that could make it do so. It's a victim of circumstance. Now, the ball follows a path that's determined by the movement of the maze. Sometimes it hits a wall and retreats. Sometimes it takes a turn and makes its way onto another path. That's how we are with time. Now say I was to cut a hole in the bottom of the maze and allow the ball to fall through. I've altered the movement at a certain point. Now, every marble you drop in will inevitably fall to that point eventually. That's what the first traveler did back in 1941. He changed the shape of the loop. Essentially, he cut off time at that point. That's the end now. So, no other time exists? Iris rubbed her temples and squinted her eyes slightly against the noon sun. That depends. It certainly existed once, or else I wouldn't be standing before you. We have memories of it, so that makes it real in some sense. But it's not tangible to us anymore. To the best of my knowledge, there is no way to get there, even with all the advances our program has made. Please think of the risk that it took to travel the first time. No one knew if it would result in destroying our present timeline. We got lucky. The past is gone, but the present is intact. And truth be told, isn't that the way it's always been? I've had almost 70 years to process it, and it's still a lot. The key is to stop thinking of time as something that exists or doesn't. Once you condition your brain to get rid of that burden, it's a whole lot lighter. But you could have traveled years into the past. Why limit yourselves to a day? Some of the group, myself included, believed that we shouldn't attempt any longer than 24 hours, as it was unknown how such travel could affect self-actualization. In other words, what if you went back and caused some horrible chain of events that altered the world in a negative way, or made your future self cease to exist? That's what we believed, anyway. The risk was far too great. You don't believe that anymore? I don't know. There is another reason, though. And I suppose that brings me back to Penny. Penny theorized, quite correctly, that although we could alter a course of events, it would be impossible to erase the memory of that event. In other words, we needed to act very quickly when we attempted to integrate the past, and we could only alter events that very few people knew about. In addition, it's impossible to change locations upon the timeline. Even if I could have gone back to Egypt in the time of pharaohs, for example, I'd end up popping out exactly where the machine stood, be it the bottom of a lake or the side of a mountain. And then, once I was there, I couldn't ever get back. The body travels, you see, along with anything on it, but the machine is stationary. We knew that 24 hours prior, the machine was in the basement of the university's physics lab, and we had a good mind to think that it would be 24 hours later. The machine looked like an ordinary elevator of the time, you see. Someone who came into the lab would have no idea that it wasn't. There were doors on both sides of the elevator, one set to enter through, and one set to exit by. The exit door led straight into a small service corridor that no one else had access to, which in turn led to an alleyway that would bring a person outside onto the main part of campus, where they would blend in with the crowd. The traveler was instructed to immediately find their way out without coming into contact with their present self. It's rather easy to remember the movements you made a day before to avoid accidents. So once someone went back and altered an event, what then? Well, they simply came home. Future travel is far easier from a scientific standpoint, although not without risks. Before each and every integration, the machine was programmed with a return date and time of departure. Once the alteration was completed, the traveler made their way back to the machine and waited for it to return. When we had travelers out, there was a very strict protocol about how we handled the machines and the lab, lest we ruin their return. If you travel back to the past, are you gone in the present? That you are. Self-consistency dictates that anything you do to alter your present state remains true. If you're in the past for a week, then you're gone for a week in our perceived time. Is that what happened to Penny? She's stuck somewhere back in time still, perpetually living 24 hours in the past, and we can never catch up with her. Iris thoughtfully tapped the side of her mug and let out a long sigh. I wish it were that simple, but no. Penny isn't in the past at all. Quite simply, she's in the future. She glanced up at me to gauge my reaction, which was one of admitted shock. How far in the future? Well, the answer to that changes with each passing second, doesn't it? But if I'm correct, and I believe I am, she's due to arrive in our present timeline in 3 days, early in the morning. She traveled from 1947 to 2014? I have my suspicions as to why, but first let me explain how it came to be. Help an old woman up, will you? The game is due to let out any minute, and I don't want those old bastards ruining our conversation. We'll just take a stroll. She was up and moving slowly, with her arm crooked inside my own by the time she started talking again. Penny was the last person you'd ever suspect of breaking the rules, but I know for a fact that she did, and she did it often. She used the machine to travel for her own leisure, well past the 24-hour mark, and she did it alone. It wasn't just risky, it was reckless, and I told her as much. Where did she go? You mean when, my dear boy? I smiled and nodded. Yes, when. She went back to revisit moments that were special to her. If she was having a bad day, she went back a few years to a particularly good one. It seems harmless enough. She thought so as well, and there was a time when I came to accept that it was too, all things considered. But then very peculiar things started to happen. What sort of things? Peculiar how? We found a bench overlooking a duck pond, and Iris motioned for me to sit down. She took her seat slowly and with some effort. She tipped her mug forward as if searching for more tea, even though it had been drained, and then sat it down beside her. Well, there was one incident in particular that, looking back, was probably the start of things going south. We had thrown Penny a birthday party back in 1946 at a restaurant called Paulson's. It's not there anymore, but it was a lovely place in its day. She had gone back to revisit the day about 6 months later, watching the festivities from a table in the back, well hidden. She came home exuberant, reminding me of the conversation and jokes and the fun we'd had. That night was special to me as well. I had danced for hours with your grandfather at that restaurant after barely saying 2 words to him in all the months I'd known him. Since that night, we'd been in a state of constant in-between. Flirting, talking for hours, making excuses to see each other, but nothing happened. He was such a shy creature. Since that night, I had been desperate to know if he was as crazy for me as I was for him. So, the next evening, I asked her if we could go back. I wanted to go to that night's restaurant once again, and she obliged me. When we left the elevator, we didn't have a worry in the world, knowing no one was in the lab and we didn't have to risk being caught. We giggled like schoolgirls, linking arms as we half-skipped through the city. It was just so thrilling to be doing something we knew we shouldn't. I'd been such a goody two-shoes for so much of my life. It was the first time I'd ever been in a situation where I might encounter myself, my past self, that is. And I can't tell you what excitement had come over me at the chance to revisit a night I'd experienced before. I took care to style my hair a bit differently, to wear a dress that I'd recently purchased, and to choose a hat that would cover some of my face, but not draw too much attention to me. I was confident that I could blend in with the crowd, and not have a soul recognize me. I knew I couldn't change anything about that night, and I didn't want to. I wanted to see myself look at your grandfather with those fresh eyes again. I wanted to see things I'd been too caught up in to notice the first time, to determine if he and I were as meant for each other as I believed. Her eyes clouded over slightly, misty, caught in memories of years and people long ago. I reached over and gave her hand a squeeze. "Oh, listen to me, a silly old woman." She shook her head with a laugh, as if the motion could get rid of the memories and the feelings they'd brought back. When we got to the restaurant, we immediately walked towards the back and peered in a small window that was slightly ajar. We couldn't see our group in the front quite yet, but suddenly I recognized my own laugh bellowing through the restaurant. Imagine that, Philip. How surreal it was, hearing my laugh, but knowing it didn't come from my present body. It sounds like an amazing experience. Oh, it was. It surely was. I wanted to go inside and get a closer look, so we concealed our faces as best we could behind our handbags and made our way through the door. I felt like I was floating. That's how euphoric I was. I was daring enough to walk about 5 feet behind your grandfather as he sat with the computer expert. I could hear them talking about me. "She's stunning," grandfather said. "Stunning." He'd never said that to me directly, and I think a moment or two went by where I forgot to breathe. Penny had to pull my arm to remind me to walk away. I know I had the stupidest grin on my face that you can imagine and cheeks as red as apples. I was leaning in to whisper to Penny what I'd heard when she came to a dead stop, pulling my arm back with her. I saw then what she did. There she was, the Penny of the day before, sitting at the back table where she'd hidden, and she'd seen us. She had this little surprised look on her face. Not shock, really, but curiosity. I just stood staring back like a great gob of a girl, until I snapped out of my daze and followed Penny back out the door. So the Penny of the day before saw her future self, essentially in the past. Yes, oh God, what a paradox. We were floored, stunned even. Not that we'd seen the Penny of the day before. That wasn't the shocking part. We'd theorized about that and understood it was the most likely possibility. By the time your present self travels back, your past self has already traveled there as well. Theoretically, there can be infinite forms of yourself from different points in the loop, all in the same place at once. Then, why the shock? Because present timeline Penny had no memory of it happening. Remember what I told you. Memories can't be erased, even if the loop is altered. Everything that we thought we knew about time travel told us that present Penny should have a memory of seeing her future self the day before in the restaurant. It had already happened. But she did not. She swore that to me, and I believe her. On her first trip back to Paulson's, she sat down, drank a glass of wine, watched the past reality group dancing, and left. On her first trip, just the day before in our present reality, we weren't there. But the next day, same place, same time, we were. How could that have happened? Iris let out a long sigh as she shook her head. We just don't know. We knew that we could change the past, of course. We never realized we could alter a past self outside of our own reality. To not have the present aware of the changes to the past was unprecedented and frightening. I was sure that we had broken time for good. We worried that when we returned to the present day, everything would be completely screwy. We ran back to the lab, hopped in the machine, and hardly spoke a word, both of us just expecting the absolute worst. Did anything change? Not that we could observe. But then again, I don't know how we'd possibly know. As I've thought of it over the years, I've come to accept that I'll never know. Many things could have changed. Small things. Big things even. But thinking of it too much starts to mess with your head. It starts to make you doubt your own reality. We were getting to dangerous territory, and both agreed it should stop immediately. We didn't tell anyone about that day, although we should have. They could have helped us understand, perhaps. She and I were just so young, so inexperienced. Her voice began to trail off as she looked beyond me, lost in memory. We don't have to continue if you're tired. I can come back tomorrow. Another dismissive wave of the hand. No, this can't wait. I promised you I'd tell you what I know about Penny. Why did she start traveling to the future? Wasn't that forbidden? Iris gave a low, slow nod before continuing. After we returned from the incident at the restaurant, Penny was noticeably different. She was withdrawn and distracted. She'd oversleep and come to work late, making simple mistakes in the lab. It was suggested that she take a bit of a vacation, as she was most likely overworked. That may have been partly true, but I know there was much more to it. Penny was confronted with the knowledge that her travels may have resulted in things she had no memory of. That her present self in another timeline may have experienced things that she didn't even know about. That the collision of past, present, and future loops on the curve may result in completely alternate realities. That's sobering knowledge. She left for a month. California, she said. Sunshine, movie stars. We encouraged her to relax and take her time. But when she returned, she didn't seem much better, only more determined to pretend she was. I worried about her and tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't let me in. Eventually, I gave up. About 3 months after her return, I woke up just before the sun to the sound of Penny leaving our apartment. I was concerned for her and threw on a robe in an attempt to follow her. She was way ahead of me, but I had a hunch as to where I could find her. She was just about to enter the machine when I walked into the lab. She clutched a rucksack as if she intended to be gone for some time. We locked eyes for what seemed like an eternity. Oh, she had these big brown eyes, and they had so much sadness to them that night. It almost took my breath away. I opened my mouth to speak to her, but she quickly held up a hand to stop me. "Iris," she said, "I need to go." My grandmother's voice caught in her throat, and she swallowed hard. "Did you ask her why?" Iris gave a silent nod. "Did she tell you?" A silent shake of the head. She just walked backward into the machine, looking at me the whole time, tears falling down her face. She told me she was sorry, and then she was gone. Iris and I sat in silence for a few moments. Somewhere in the distance, geese squawked. A cool breeze blew in, catching a pile of leaves in a whirl of wind. I realized I had suddenly become aware of other things around us for the first time since Iris told me her story. I was so wrapped up in her, in processing what she was saying, that everything else ceased to exist. I glanced quickly at my watch. An hour had passed. How could that be? Time is conceptual indeed, and for that hour I was completely ignorant to it. I'm pretty sure I'm safe for now, physically. I've slept with my issue on my nightstand for almost 2 decades, and I'm well versed in how to use it. My mental well-being, well, that's a whole other issue. The possibility of this all being true is ridiculous, and yet I think it is. I believe, Iris, I told you that yesterday, but I want to restate it. I believe that Iris traveled in time. I believe that on Tuesday morning I may meet a time traveler she used to work with, but I'm still not comfortable believing it, you know? That's going to take some time. So, last night I turned to the only thing I could think of to make sense of the nonsensical. Whiskey. Lots of whiskey. At a certain point, I thought I'd solved the mysteries of the universe, but it turns out it was just the Glenlivet talking. So, I need to finish telling you about Penny. There's more, and it's complicated. After Iris told me about Penny's departure into the future, I sat in stunned silence. Nervously, I fumbled with Penny's file, still clutched in my hand. I was embarrassed to see that I had been gripping it so tightly that it was slightly bent and damp with the sweat from my palm. There were several witness statements inside. One was from Iris, identified only as her roommate. In it, she claimed that it was her understanding Penny had gone back to England. Her statement was corroborated by several others, who I assumed must also be part of the project. There was only one statement that seemed out of place, given by the boyfriend who reported her missing. I'll call him Theo. Penny had a boyfriend? Theo. Iris inhaled deeply. He seemed to think so, didn't he? My recollection is that they went on 2, maybe 3 dates, but that it was nothing serious. Penny was one of our best travelers, Philip. She took a lot of the riskier projects, and it was expected that she keep as few ties as possible. She had no job other than the lab. Only my name was on the lease to our apartment. She didn't seek out friendships. And her foreign citizenship gave her a very valid excuse to be gone for long periods of time if necessary. I don't know what led her to go with this Theo character, but I know that he and that missing persons report led to some big problems for our team. If he hadn't been around, no one outside of the project would have known she was gone. Well, I said, shutting the file, it doesn't look like he ever followed up. No, I suppose not. She covered her mouth to stifle a laugh. I'm sure that there was a substantial monetary contribution that made its way into Theo's life to ensure that he didn't. So Penny left the lab in 1947, and she chooses to come to 2014. I still don't understand why. We think it was an accident. When we checked the machine to see the last destination, we discovered that there had been a logarithm entered for October 28, 2014. The logarithms contain code written in binary. Do you have a piece of paper? I ripped a page out of my notebook and handed it to her along with a pen, and she wrote furiously before thrusting it back in front of me. The date she's traveling to looks like this. It was a string of zeros, ones, and lowercase letters. Year, then month, then day. Penny was nervous and relatively inexperienced at writing code and programming the machine. She made a mistake. She was probably trying to enter a date 50 or 100 years in the future. Seems like a nice round number for someone running away. She did some more scribbling. That's the same date in 1997. See how similar? I nodded. But why? Why did she want to go to the future? Why not just go back to England or anywhere else in the world? I think she meant to go to a point on the loop where she believed everyone she knew would be gone. She was running away and wanted to make sure no one who knew her would still be alive. She didn't count on me living a ridiculously long time. Why? Why travel to such an unknown future? Iris stared at the pond for a few moments, silently, contemplating how to word her answer. She was in trouble, Philip. Your grandfather gave everyone who traveled complete physicals once a month. For one thing, we needed to make sure we were healthy enough to go through the process and not keel over somewhere in the past, which would have surely raised quite a few questions. Secondly, he was studying the long-term effects of what we were doing on the body. Penny had recently completed her physical. It was late, since she had been away and hadn't traveled. She was sick. No, not sick. Penny was pregnant, Philip. Is pregnant, I suppose. She was pregnant when she left. Jesus. Poor Penny. So afraid to have an illegitimate child that she left behind her entire life. She'd certainly picked a good time to travel to. No one would bat an eye in our time. I assume it was Theo's. That's just it. It couldn't be. She'd only just met him weeks before, and according to your grandfather, she was several months along. No, it coincided perfectly with the trip to California. Sounds like she was doing more than relaxing. Iris cracked a smile despite her best efforts. Maybe so, but I've had a long time to think about it, and the more I do, the less sure I am that she actually went there. I think that she took the opportunity to try and answer some of the questions she had about time, reality, and herself. She wasn't the type to look for the answers to life's questions at the end of an equation like so many of us on the team were. No, I'm afraid that she spent that month somewhere in the past, or even in the future. And I think that's when she became pregnant, and I believe that's why she left. So, in 3 days' time, a pregnant time traveler is going to show up in the basement of a lab at the university. Well, when you put it that way, it seems so simple, doesn't it? 2 elderly men in plush-looking tracksuits and thick eyeglasses walked past us, each with a camera in their hand. Iris exchanged pleasantries with them, as they explained they were taking a walk to capture some fall foliage. My mind was racing, and I tried to will the men away with thought alone to continue our conversation. When they finally walked away, I turned to Iris, full of anxious energy. Why didn't someone travel back to stop her from leaving? We tried. Remember how I told you we could not go back further than the point where the first loop was created in 1941? Curiously, we found ourselves unable to go even a second past the point where Penny left her present for the future. We would arrive, time and time again, just as she had gone. Penny closed another loop. We couldn't get past that moment no matter what. Okay, why didn't anyone travel to the future then? To the point of time she'd gone to? We were preparing to. I had volunteered to go, and we were working out the details. But just a few days after Penny left, 2 men came out of the machine. 2 men we didn't know. The door opened, and they stumbled out, surprised to see all of us staring back, mouths agape. A couple of the engineers grabbed whatever tools they could to protect us if necessary, but the rest of us sat there like a bunch of nimrods. They put their hands up like they were surrendering. "Our mistake," one of them said. "We were just looking for someone, and we made a mistake. We're going back now." And then they walked back to the machine. "You let them get away?" I wasn't exactly in a position to stop them. We had no idea who they were or who sent them. Based on their dress, we figured they were from the future. If I had to guess now, I'd say they could walk down the street today and blend right in. Before the machine doors closed, I heard one start to speak to the other, and I'm almost positive that Penny's name was mentioned. They were looking for Penny? I believe so. That's why it was too risky for us to travel there. Someone from a future date was attempting to go back and stop her from traveling. As for why, I have no idea. That's why we need to find Penny when she arrives tomorrow. We need to find her and help her. I believe her life, and the life of that child, depends on it. Do you think we can convince her? I mean, assuming you want to come as well? I'd want to make sure the logarithms were correct. Iris sat silently, a look of consternation forming on her sweet face. My dear boy, she can't go back. Why not? The machine is gone. Gone? Gone where? I felt a sudden tickle of heat start to crawl up the back of my neck, whispering on the backs of my ears, and I was instantly embarrassed by it. That morning, I'd never even heard of Penelope Allswell, never given the possibility that time travel was real, even a cursory thought, and now here I was, literally becoming physically agitated to find she might never be able to return to her own reality. The program was shut down less than a week after Penny left. You have to understand we were considered a liability at that point. The police were poking around. Strange travelers were popping in from the future. It was a mess. It's bad form to have team members break protocol and mess with the entire time-space continuum, apparently, she said with a shrug. We begged them to reconsider even for a few more days, but it was done. They dismantled the machine, and they shut us down. And if Penny ever did want to return, she couldn't possibly do it. Not from that machine, anyway. Are there others? Maybe. I never saw another, but by now there must be. Those 2 men traveled somehow and from somewhere. And then, what? Everyone involved in the project just walked away? back to normal lives and pretended that none of this happened? Well, yes, more or less. We were all told, in no uncertain terms mind you, that we were never to speak of our work at the university, or there would be dire consequences. Naturally, I believed that, as I used to be one of the people in charge of delivering those dire consequences, if you know what I mean. Your grandfather and I were married within a few months, and we settled down into a normal life. But I never stopped thinking about her, not ever. The guilt, it just doesn't go away. Your grandfather encouraged me to forget about it and move on, but it wasn't so easy. Her voice began to trail off, and she was silent for close to a minute. Iris? When she turned to me, she clutched both of my hands in hers. Her soft green eyes were clouded with tears. Oh, Philip, I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm only asking you to be there when I believe she'll come through. If it doesn't happen, you can forget all of this and chalk it up to the rantings of a delusional old biddy. But please, promise me you'll be there. I bit my bottom lip, something I do when I'm nervous. And if she does come through? Iris could no longer contain the tears, and they slid down her face freely. Then you have to protect her, Philip. You have to protect Penny and her baby. You have to do whatever you can to make sure no one harms them. Without even being conscious of what I was doing, my head began to nod. Yes, I heard myself saying, as if my voice was from another time as well. I'll do it. And so I'm going to. I have no idea how. I don't know how I'll convince her to trust me. I don't know how I'll keep her safe. And I don't know how to avoid people who can travel through time. But I know that I have to try. For Penny, for Iris, for me. I've got 2 days to figure this out. Last night, armed with a map that Iris drew, I was making my way through campus in search of the lab. It was a Monday evening, too late for most classes, but the perfect time for a leisurely jog through campus. A couple walking a massive dog of some sort made their way through the cobblestone paths that connect various buildings, and I passed a rowdy group of boys wearing university crew jackets, presumably on their way to the boathouse for a late-night scull. Iris knew that Penny had left 1947 around 5 in the morning, give or take a half hour, making formulating a plan difficult. Did I arrive early and hope to get in? I didn't see a way. The doors were locked overnight, and there was a security system on the doors and windows. Did I take my chances and try to intercept Penny when she exited the lab? Too risky. If I had to chase her, or carry her away kicking and screaming, I'd surely draw too much attention to us. There was only one option that seemed feasible: to arrive the night before, and camp out undetected overnight. If I were caught by a student burning the midnight oil, or a custodian, I'd whip out my badge, start talking quickly, and hope for the best. But for the time being, I looked like your everyday middle-aged jogger with a bum leg trying to get my exercise in, wincing every couple of steps. My baggy sweatshirt and track pants concealed my holster and issue, a flashlight, and 2 things that Iris gave me to legitimize myself to Penny: a picture of them together, and a brooch she left behind in 1947. I'd rented a room at a motel not too far outside of town, the kind that doesn't ask many questions, as they say. My car was packed with essentials: clothes, toiletries, this laptop. I figured hiding out was safer than returning to my apartment, at least for now. Work thought I was having issues with my leg and needed a couple of days to recuperate while working from home, another benefit of a desk job. My kid was skipping this Tuesday instead of 2 days next week. Everything was in place. The lab was housed in an academic building that was the same as most other academic buildings on campus. Big, old, beautiful, and yet entirely unassuming. The things that have happened on this campus, the things that were discussed and dreamed up and invented, are pretty miraculous, but nothing can possibly compare to what happened in that lab. but I guarantee you'd never know it from the outside. One thing that cops learn quickly is that almost everything is hidden in plain sight. Not since the pirate days have people buried their treasure on deserted islands never to be found. Nowadays, people stash drugs inside the fabric lining of their trunk and stick murder weapons inside a bag of frozen peas sealed with a rubber band. There's so much that's just beneath the surface, just beyond the place that our eyes can see and our minds can reach. No wonder they chose this place. I made my way up the wide granite steps, flanked on either side by 50-foot elms, and put my hand on the door handle. With a deep breath, I opened it and stepped inside and into a long, silent corridor. I have to admit that there was a moment when I nearly turned back around and left. I was either about to prove that I was a lunatic or that everything I thought I knew about the universe was total bullshit. The thought of my couch, a cold beer, and Monday Night Football was ridiculously appealing, but like Iris said, you can't erase a memory no matter what. Whether I went through with this or not, it wasn't going away. I took the stairs to the basement slowly, pausing with each turn until I reached a corridor similar to the one upstairs, but completely dark except a glowing exit sign pointing back to the stairs. The lab was at the end of the hall, towards the back of the building, and the furthest door away from me. Of course. I steeled my mind to think of this as work. I was on the job. On the job, I can't feel fear because fear can kill a man in my line of work. With a couple of deep breaths and my hand hovering over my gun, I made it to the door and pushed it gently. It opened without effort. I wish I could tell you I found a creepy old laboratory that looked like something out of Young Frankenstein, but I didn't. In fact, it looked more like an old science classroom than anything else. It was warm, close to the building's boiler, I presume, and incredibly dusty. A good half of the room was full of cardboard boxes and bins, reams of printer paper, and whatever else didn't have a home anywhere in the building. The one-time home of the most important invention mankind had ever seen had been reduced to an oversized storage closet. There weren't any windows, but I didn't dare turn on a light, so I locked the door behind me and poked around a bit. I recognized the set of exit doors leading to the service corridor Iris mentioned and opened them quietly, peering inside with the light. Empty, but I'd have to keep an eye on it. I pushed a couple of boxes against the inside to create a little barrier and buy myself some time if needed. The only indication that the machine ever existed was a square indent in the floor tiles, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet and elevator-shaped. As I stood there, I felt a wave of something rush over me. Anxiety? Anticipation? Something else entirely? Shrugging off the shiver, I pulled up a chair and got comfortable. And then I waited, and waited, and waited some more. I didn't think there would be a chance I'd sleep, but as the hours went by, I found my eyelids growing heavy in the dark, warm room. I pulled my phone out to set an alarm, just in case, only to discover the battery was completely drained, even though I'm positive it was nearly full when I walked in. I tried the flashlight to discover that it, too, was useless. Sitting in silence, in the dark, with no idea what time it was. How apropos. And then, suddenly but slowly, something began to change. At first, it was just the energy in the room. My skin got goosebumps, and every hair on my body stood upright. Startled, I stood up from the chair, only to find that it was physically difficult for me to do so. Like the gravity around me had increased, and I was fighting against it to stand. Everything began to get wavy, like the way blacktop can appear from a distance on a hot summer's day. I heard a noise, somehow not filling the room, but only in my own head. High-pitched, screeching. And that's the last thing I remember until I opened my eyes to see Penny's face staring down at me, her wild auburn curls framing her worried face. Philip. One hand tapped the side of my face to rouse me, while the other was fixed on my pulse. Come on now, Philip. What I wanted to do was ask Penny how she knew my name and what the hell happened to me, but what came out sounded something like the noise a donkey makes. Penny smiled slyly, raising one eyebrow. That's quite the greeting, and hello to you too. Now can you sit up? She slid an arm under my back and guided me up with surprising strength. That's a boy. How are you feeling? I felt like I'd been run over by a truck, but all I could manage to get out was a weak fine. Iris should have warned you not to sit too close, you know. Without the machine, there's very little to contain all the energy. You probably just experienced the equivalent of being within 20 kilometers or so of an atom bomb detonation. But you're okay? Yes, I wasn't here yet when it happened, technically. I arrived the moment after, completely unaffected. However, the ruckus may have drawn the attention of anyone in this building who is still conscious or nearby. Let's make haste if you're able. I rubbed my temples vigorously in an attempt to regain my composure. My knee ached, but so did every muscle in my body. More importantly, I didn't understand what was happening. Penny didn't seem afraid of me, and she knew my name. Nodding, I got to my feet slowly. Penny took my arm, pushed my barricade out of the way, and led me out of the lab and onto campus. Luckily, the energy force should have wiped out any security footage from tonight. Nice little unintended benefit, eh? We might walk quickly, though, just in case. Which way to the car? I can't. In the distance, I heard the faint sound of sirens approaching. Penny clearly heard them too. Turning to face me, she reached up and placed a hand on either side of my face, looking me directly in the eyes. Think, Philip. You can do this. Take a deep breath. Yes, that's it. Now think about where you've parked the car. We need to get out of here. Academy Street. The lot behind the bank. It's a silver Volkswagen Touareg. Yes, good. You're doing a brilliant job. Taking my arm again, she led me to the car, walking as fast as I could manage. I took out my keys, but Penny took them from my hand. No, you're in no condition for that. Get in. I can manage. I was still too dazed to protest. My head was throbbing to beat the ringing in my ears, and I felt like I could vomit at any moment. Where to? Penny asked while starting the car. She adjusted the seat and mirror with ease, turned off the radio and GPS, and peeled out of the lot. I managed to give directions to the hotel before needing to close my eyes to stave off the dizziness. Where did you learn to drive like this? Oh, Penny said, looking over at me with a look that was impossible to interpret. You taught me. And with that, I was out again. When I awoke, the afternoon sun was high in the sky, peeking in slightly through the closed brown tweed curtains, and I was tucked under several layers of scratchy motel sheets. I sat up, still a bit lightheaded, and but infinitely better than I had been. Penny was sitting in a desk chair, but immediately rose and came to me when I stirred. Take it easy now, she said, sitting on the edge of the bed and thrusting a bottle of orange Gatorade in front of me. I might recommend this to start to get your electrolytes back in line. Then some water, and when you feel well enough, a little food. Where did? I struggled to clear my dry throat. Where did all of this come from? The market down the road. I took some bills from your wallet. I hope you don't mind. Most of my money is horribly old-fashioned looking. You went alone? Yes, although I put your gun in my rucksack just in case I needed it. I'm perfectly fine, though. We're safe for now. My gun. Jesus. I'd been unconscious for hours and left my gun unattended. How are you feeling? Kind of like I have a raging hangover without the memories of all the fun. Well, rest up. and when you feel better, we can talk." She rose to leave, but I grabbed her arm at the wrist. "No, I need to talk now. How do you know who I am? Why did you come with me so willingly?" Clearly, there are things Iris didn't tell me. Penny sighed and nodded her head. "Right. So, am I to assume you spoke with Iris, but she didn't tell you the whole story?" It's like she was reading my mind. I nodded, then summarized what Iris had told me days before, with the exception of the pregnancy. Truth be told, I was too embarrassed to mention it, not knowing if the woman herself was aware. Penny sat in silence, nodding on occasion, or adding a slight sound of agreement. When I was all done, she stood up and began pacing the room. Well, that's all true, although some inconsequential details are off a bit, and some rather important details were omitted. I was very disturbed after the incident at Paulson's restaurant. Imagine knowing that things have happened to you that you have no memory of whatsoever. It's horrific. I had always assumed that even when I traveled back, I retained my sense of self. All versions of me were still, well, me, with everything intact. That isn't the case, and threw me for a bit of an existential crisis, I'm afraid. "But it was still you in the restaurant." "Was it?" she asked thoughtfully. "It looked like me and dressed like me, and at one time I remember it being me. But if I have no control over that body's emotions or actions or mind, is it really me?" I shrugged, not knowing what else to do. "Yes, well, as it turns out, Descartes wasn't too far out of line here. I think, therefore I am. I am only one me, you see, the one I am currently able to control. The rest of my duplicates are something else entirely, although I don't know what. The worst part of all of this wasn't that there were these versions of me floating around with their own consciousness, but that actions that they were exposed to could affect my present self. Anything that happened in the past to me, any version, could affect the present me." Her voice was lovely, an aristocratic British accent, no doubt a product of fine religious schooling, had a soothing quality to it, and I struggled to sit up further so I wouldn't be tempted to close my eyes and drift back to sleep. "So, the knowledge of all of this became too much, and you escaped into the future?" "Not really escaped, no. Just went looking for answers, I suppose. After that night in the restaurant, I broke a promise to your grandmother, and I went back to a past I visited once more. Not to the restaurant again, but to a park that I'd been to just a couple of weeks before. I just sort of sat around on a bench for a bit, trying to clear my mind. Nothing extraordinary. Why did you revisit that place?" "Well," her mouth scrunched up slightly with embarrassment, "I wanted to test out my theory. So I placed a rather long nail upright on the back of the bench right where I figured my arse would be." "Jesus. Why? What were you trying to prove?" Coming closer to me, she rolled the waist of her pants down slightly, revealing a long, thin scar, still pink and shiny. This scar wasn't on my body until I returned and put the nail on the bench. I must have done a number getting it out, as you can see. And although I remember placing the nail there, I have no recollection of sitting on it or the associated pain. Things were starting to come together for me. Could a duplicate version of Penny have become pregnant while traveling to the past without present Penny's knowledge? I opened my mouth to ask her when she began to speak again. And so, I knew then that there was some real danger in visiting the same point of time more than once, even if we never made contact with our other selves. The theory we operated for didn't allow for multiplicity in the future, since we're traveling on a loop that technically hasn't happened yet. When we travel to the future, we alter it, but we don't ever duplicate it. So I figured I'd explore there a bit. And that's where I met you. When? Christmas Day of this year, 2014. Why did you come to that date? You could have gone anywhere." She blushed slightly. "Many reasons. Firstly, I figured the lab and campus would be relatively unattended due to the holiday, and I was right on that account. I slid out the back door without notice. But more so, I chose the date of my birth, December 24th. That day in 2014 would have been my 100th birthday, although now I suppose it will be my 33rd. Anyway, I found it relatively easy to blend in once I arrived, social behavior being my specialty, so I'd prepared myself a bit for the unknown. Once I learned to use a personal computer, things went relatively smoothly." "Where did you stay?" "In various campus buildings, the library, wherever else I could. I would have simply slept outside, but the weather had turned far too cold. Curiosity got the best of me, and I looked up your grandmother. She was far younger than the rest of us, and I hoped she may still be living and able to help me. And there she was, in the telephone directory. I called the number, and discovered it belonged to the nursing home, so I took a chance and went to visit her. I wanted her to know I was okay, but also, selfishly, I wanted to relieve myself of some of the guilt I had about involving her in my risky traveling. It was at the nursing home where I met you. I told you my story, and you offered to help me. And I believed you, just like that. Well, no, not at first. But you had a hunch that if I was who I said I was, there would be a file for me at your precinct, and of course there is. I could tell you all the information in my file with astonishing accuracy. I could describe your grandparents perfectly. And there was, of course, a picture of Iris and I together, from the 1940s. In fact, I believe it's the picture that you've been carrying around with you today. Why couldn't Iris just verify who you were?" Penny lowered her head and sighed deeply. "Philip, when I arrived at your time initially, Iris was in no condition to verify anything." I stood up quickly, nearly falling off the bed in the process. "What do you mean, no condition?" "She's had an apoplexy of some sort. Or will have in a couple of days. I'm sorry to have to tell you like this, but I thought maybe you'd like to have a little more time with her. You always said that one of your biggest regrets was that you hadn't seen her or spoken with her in so long, and then it was suddenly too late." "I just saw her yesterday." "Yes, in this version of events you did, because she called you to her. Things have changed. When I first met you, you hadn't seen her in quite a while by the time she fell ill. Busy, you said. I need you to explain everything to me, Penny. I need to know what the hell is going on here." I know. She moved to put a hand on my shoulder, but thought better of it, and sat back down in the chair. "Fair enough. When I was in 2014 the first time, you and I grew close." "How close, Penny?" "Very close. I thought I detected a hint of sadness in her eyes. I know you don't know me right now, but you once did very well. We had something of a life together, if only for a month or so. It was really lovely, but you never quite believed me about where I came from. You tried, but you needed proof. And so you went to the lab to see for yourself, and things went horribly downhill. I was what? Killed?" She managed only a nod as tears streamed down her face. "And you went back to 1947? "Yes, I had to. Once I got back, Iris helped me a great deal. I told her everything, that I had met her grandson, that he had been killed, that she had fallen ill. And then we plotted everything out on paper, mapping a timeline, and tried to eliminate all the mistakes we could, which took some time. Eventually, we felt confident that I could travel here today and meet you, and that at that point, the machine could be destroyed in 1947. We didn't know for sure if it would work. I risked being obliterated when I arrived, but so far, it seems to have worked." Iris conveniently left many of those details out, My death, for example. She didn't want to worry you needlessly, especially since I'm confident we can change it. The machine is gone. We've already changed that part. How did I die? Philip, trust me. It won't help you to know the details. It's a burden I should know. All I'll say is that you died saving me, and it worked. I escaped through the machine, and it became my turn to save you. People tried to find you, you know? Back in 1947, 2 men came out of the machine before it was destroyed. They were looking for you. Perhaps, but that was a different reality. When the future changes, it's so unlike the past. There's nothing residual left hanging around. No multiplicity. It's simply gone, as if it never happened and we're left to fill it with whatever we wish. There can't possibly be any permanence to something that hasn't happened to our present selves yet. And yet, there are still things that can't be undone, no matter what. Like the baby. Penny was visibly startled. You knew? I was going to tell you, but I thought it may be too much all at once. I didn't realize that Iris already had. Is it mine, Penny? She managed a small smile. Seems likely, yes. Likely. Not positively? Well, you're the only one that for quite some time, of course. But given that everything I thought I knew about reality has been turned on its head as of late, I can say very few things with absolute and total certainty. Instinctively, her hand went to her stomach, and the baby, still unnoticeable, inside. Just as instinctively, I went to her. I know this is a lot to handle, Philip. I nodded. We'll figure it out. We've got time. I moved an arm around her shoulder to comfort her and was shocked at how familiar it felt. A woman who should never have been alive for me to meet was carrying a baby that we hadn't created yet. And here I was, holding her. I'm glad to hear you say that because if we're sticking together, there's something else you should know. What? Those boxes down in the lab? Quite a few of them were knocked down upon my arrival, and I couldn't help but see what was inside. Don't tell me, I thought to myself. Don't tell me what I know you're going to tell me. Philip, it looks like they're rebuilding the machine. As a wise woman once said, the past is gone, but the present is still intact. And isn't that the way it's always been? As for the future, it's simply unknown, no matter how well we think we have it figured out. I don't know how much I'll be posting from here on out. I don't know what we're going to do or how we're going to do it. But I'm pretty sure that whatever it is starts with making sure that machine is never rebuilt. So thanks for coming along on the ride. I'm open to suggestions here. But I can unequivocally say that I'm not going to videotape her post her picture or exploit her any more than I already have. As for my safety, who knows? I've got a lot of stuff to look into, proxy servers and shell accounts, a very large guard dog. But for now, well, the future is uncertain.